Elizabeth Siders was already facing 16 felony charges. Now, prosecutors say there may be more. And buried inside a new court filing is one sentence that could dramatically change the Ohio case involving 16 children. Vinton County Prosecutor William Archer says Elizabeth has new serious felony charges that will be considered by a grand jury. But prosecutors did not reveal what those charges are. They did not say how many there could be. They did not describe the alleged conduct behind them. And they did not explain whether investigators uncovered something new after 16 children were removed from the family home. That unanswered question has now become one of the biggest mysteries in the case, because almost 2 months after the arrests, prosecutors appear to be signaling that the original charges may only have been the beginning. And there is another detail that makes this even more significant. Prosecutors filed a similar response involving Christina Siders, Elizabeth's mother-in-law, but the reference to new serious felony charges appears specifically in Elizabeth's case. So why? What did investigators find? And what could happen when this case finally goes before a grand jury? On August 17th, prosecutors filed a memorandum opposing Elizabeth Siders' request for a lower bond. Elizabeth has been jailed since June 30th. Her bond is currently set at $300,000. Her attorney, J. Thomas Stolley, has argued that she cannot afford it. The defense asked the court to release her on her own recognizance under strict conditions. Those conditions could include GPS monitoring, regular supervision, and a stable place to live. Stolley has argued that Elizabeth has no known criminal record. He has also said there is no known history of her failing to appear in court. And according to the defense, Elizabeth has an important reason not to disappear. She wants to see her children again. But prosecutors see that same situation very differently. William Archer asked the judge to keep Elizabeth's bond exactly where it is, and he gave 3 reasons. The first was already serious. Elizabeth currently faces 16 counts of endangering children. Each count was filed as a second-degree felony. Those charges involve allegations that the children suffered serious physical harm. Elizabeth has not been convicted. The charges remain allegations. But from the state's perspective, the potential consequences are severe enough to create a risk that she could flee. Archer also argued that she could pose a danger to the alleged victims. Then came the second issue. Elizabeth's mental competency is now being evaluated. Her defense has asked experts to determine whether she is competent to stand trial. That question is about her present mental condition. Can she understand the court proceedings? Can she communicate with her attorney? Can she participate meaningfully in her own defense? Her attorney has also raised questions about her mental state at the time of the alleged offenses. Until those evaluations are complete, prosecutors say releasing her creates additional uncertainty. But then came the third reason. And this is where the filing changes everything. Archer wrote that Elizabeth faces new serious felony charges that will be considered by the grand jury. That sentence is short, but its implications are enormous. Because until now, the public knew about 16 child endangerment charges. The filing suggests prosecutors believe there may be additional criminal conduct serious enough to bring before a grand jury. What conduct? We do not know. What charges? We do not know. How many? Still unknown. And that distinction matters. There has already been speculation online about what prosecutors could be considering, but there is no responsible way to name a specific offense before the court documents do. So this video will not guess. What we can say is this. The prosecutor has now formally told a judge that additional serious felony charges involving Elizabeth are expected to be considered. That is new. And it may be the clearest sign yet that investigators believe this case goes beyond the original 16 counts. To understand why that matters, we need to return briefly to June 30th. Investigators executed search warrants at a home on Omer Street in Hamden, Ohio. Inside were 16 children. Their ages ranged from roughly 18 months to 18 years. Authorities described disturbing living conditions. Investigators said many of the children spent much of their time inside a confined section of the home. Human waste was reportedly found inside. 7 children were taken to hospitals. 2 were flown to higher-level trauma centers. Officials said several of the children had significant communication difficulties. The Ohio Attorney General's office later characterized the investigation as a case involving prolonged intrafamilial neglect and abuse. Authorities specifically said it was not being treated as human trafficking. Elizabeth Siders was identified as the mother of the children. Gary Siders Jr. was identified as their father. Gary Siders Sr. and Christina Siders are the paternal grandparents. All 4 adults were arrested. All 4 initially faced 16 counts of child endangering. But from the beginning, investigators continued working after those arrests. That is important, because an arrest does not always mark the end of an investigation. Sometimes it marks the beginning of a much deeper one. Authorities began examining how the family had lived over several years. They looked at the children's educational history, their medical history, where the family had lived, who had contact with them, and how 16 children could remain largely outside the systems that normally interact with families. Schools, doctors, social services, neighbors, government agencies. That larger investigation appears to still be active. And now prosecutors are talking about new felony charges. That raises a crucial question. Did investigators discover evidence after June 30th that was not known when the initial charges were filed? Again, prosecutors have not answered that publicly, but the timing makes the question unavoidable. There is also another clue inside the new bond filings. Christina Siders also asked the court to modify her bond. Prosecutors opposed that request too. They argued that Christina faces serious felony charges. They described her as a possible flight risk. They raised concerns about the alleged victims, and competency issues have also been raised in her case. But according to the public filings and reporting, the specific statement about new serious felony charges appears in Elizabeth's case, not Christina's. That difference is significant, but it must be interpreted carefully. It does not prove Elizabeth was more responsible. It does not prove Christina was less responsible. It does not tell us what prosecutors believe each person did. And it certainly does not establish guilt. But it does show that prosecutors are signaling something different about Elizabeth's legal exposure. They are telling the court that her current 16 charges may not represent the full case, and that immediately strengthens the state's argument against reducing bond. The defense says Elizabeth has nowhere to run, that she has little money, that she can be tracked by GPS, and that her goal is to eventually reunite with her children. But prosecutors say the stakes may be getting higher. If new felony charges are coming, then the possible consequences Elizabeth faces could also become more severe. That can strengthen a flight risk argument. And there is another complicated issue: the children themselves. Elizabeth's attorney has said she wants to see them again. Under normal circumstances, family ties can sometimes be used as evidence that a defendant has reasons to remain in the community. But this case is not normal. The children are the alleged victims. So the same desire the defense presents as a reason Elizabeth would remain nearby can also become a concern for prosecutors. Would she try to contact them? Would she try to learn where they are? Could contact interfere with the investigation or their recovery? Prosecutors have not publicly accused Elizabeth of attempting to do any of those things. That is important, but the state has explicitly argued that she could pose a potential risk to the victims. And that is why GPS monitoring alone may not resolve the issue. Electronic monitoring can tell authorities where someone has been. It does not always prevent someone from going somewhere prohibited. It does not guarantee that contact cannot occur. And it cannot remove every concern when alleged victims are children. At the same time, another legal battle is happening outside the criminal case. Vinton County is pursuing long-term custody arrangements involving the children. That process is separate from whether Elizabeth is ultimately convicted. Child protection courts focus on the best interests and safety of the children. So even if Elizabeth were released from jail, that would not automatically mean she could regain custody. Release on bond and reunification are completely different questions. And the scale of this case has already placed enormous pressure on Vinton County. 16 children require housing, medical care, therapy, education, caseworkers, transportation, long-term planning. Ohio approved emergency funding to help the county handle those costs. That alone tells you how unusual this case is. And Gary Siders Sr. created yet another challenge. He experienced serious health problems while in custody. He was eventually released on a recognizance bond. Prosecutor Archer said the medical expenses associated with keeping him jailed could have placed severe financial pressure on the county. So this is no longer just one criminal case. It is a criminal investigation, a child protection case, a mental competency case, a financial crisis for a small county, and now potentially a larger felony prosecution than anyone originally knew. There is another reason the public still knows so little. Judge Lena Rogers has issued gag orders restricting what attorneys and officials can publicly say. Those restrictions have been challenged by news organizations. But while those legal fights continue, much of the evidence remains outside public view. That makes the grand jury stage even more important. A grand jury does not decide whether Elizabeth is guilty. Its role comes earlier. Prosecutors present evidence. Jurors determine whether there is probable cause to return an indictment. If additional charges are approved, those charges would then become part of the formal criminal case. That could finally answer the question created by Archer's filing. What are these new serious felony charges? Until that happens, the wording must be treated carefully. Archer did not say Elizabeth has already been convicted. He did not say she has already been indicted on the additional offenses. He said the charges will be considered by the grand jury. That word, considered, matters. The prosecutor can ask for charges. The grand jury still has to act, and even an indictment would not establish guilt. But the filing still changes the story, because for weeks, the public focus was mainly on one question. How could 16 children allegedly live in those conditions for so long without being discovered? That mystery remains. But now the case is entering another phase. The question is becoming, what can prosecutors prove, and against whom? That is where the difference between the four defendants becomes increasingly important. At first, the charges looked almost identical. 16 counts for Elizabeth, 16 for Gary Jr., 16 for Christina, 16 for Gary Sr. But as the investigation continues, the final cases against each defendant may not remain identical. Evidence may point in different directions. Different conduct may lead to different charges. Different levels of involvement could produce different legal outcomes. And Elizabeth's August 17th filing may be the first public hint of that separation. There is also the competency issue. If Elizabeth is found competent, the criminal case can continue normally. If she is found incompetent, the court must address that before a trial can proceed. That does not automatically end the prosecution, but it can delay it significantly. So two major developments are now moving toward each other: the competency results and the grand jury. Either one could change the direction of the case. Together, they could reshape it completely. The bond decision is another piece to watch. Will Judge Rogers agree that GPS monitoring and supervision are enough? Or will she accept the prosecutor's argument that Elizabeth should remain jailed? That decision may depend partly on information the public has never seen. And that brings us back to the most important sentence in the entire filing. New serious felony charges. Not rumors, not social media speculation. A statement made by the prosecutor in a court document. But without the details, that creates three questions investigators and prosecutors may soon have to answer. First, what exactly are the additional charges? Second, what evidence led prosecutors to seek them? And third, why does this warning appear specifically in Elizabeth's bond filing? Until the grand jury acts, there may be no definitive answer. And that is what makes this new development so important. When police entered the home on June 30th, they found 16 children. That discovery shocked the community. But the criminal case did not freeze on that day. Investigators kept working. They kept gathering records. They kept interviewing people. They kept examining how the family lived and what the children experienced. And now, nearly 2 months later, prosecutors are signaling that the evidence may have taken them somewhere new. The original 16 felony charges may not be the end of the case against Elizabeth Siders. They may only be the beginning. And when the grand jury finally reveals what prosecutors have been building behind closed doors, we may learn whether the biggest development in this case was not what investigators saw when they entered the house, But what they discovered after they left